He told her to knit, not quote the law. Then she recited the statute he'd twisted and exposed his secret profits. Watch the moment a powerless grandmother schools the system that underestimated her. The chandeliers sparkled overhead, scattering light across polished marble floors and gilded mirrors, but the true glow in the room came from the sudden hush that followed Eleanor Whitmore's arrival. At 82, she moved with the certainty of someone who had carried empires on her shoulders, her posture straight, her chin lifted, her every step measured. The maitre d' rushed forward, bowing with exaggerated courtesy, yet his voice caught in his throat as if he, too, felt the weight of her presence. Conversations faded, the clink of glasses stilled, and even the waiters froze mid-stride, trays steady in the air, as the billionaire matriarch crossed the threshold. Her entourage walked a step behind, not close enough to crowd her, but near enough to remind the room of her importance. Two aides in dark suits whispered to each other, checking phones for messages that could never wait, while a younger assistant carried her mink shawl over one arm. Eleanor wore a long coat of deep navy wool, her white hair swept neatly into a low twist, her face lined but strong, with eyes as sharp as the day she had signed her first deal. In her world power was currency, and though her voice was soft, her silence commanded more than the loudest men in the city. She was not here for pleasure, nor to flaunt her fortune. She dined here once each year, always on the same evening, always at the same table, by the tall windows overlooking the park. It was not a habit of taste, but of memory. 35 years had passed since her daughter vanished, yet Eleanor returned to this place because it had been Lillian's favorite restaurant. She told no one the reason, not her aides, not her lawyers, not even the grandchildren she had raised alone, but the ritual endured because remembrance is sometimes heavier than grief, and Eleanor carried it like a second skin. The hostess, young and trembling, guided her across the room. Couples in evening gowns and tailored tuxedos turned their heads, some whispering about stock prices, others about the Whitmore Foundation gala. Eleanor ignored them all. She had no interest in society chatter, only in the familiar view of the windows, the soft clatter of cutlery, the taste of Bordeaux poured into fine crystal. She lowered herself carefully into the high-backed chair, her hand steady, the simple sapphire bracelet at her wrist catching the light. The identical bracelet, the one she had given to her daughter on her 18th birthday, was gone forever. The staff rushed to please her, menus offered, glasses filled, but Eleanor hardly glanced at them. She had built skyscrapers, funded hospitals, toppled rivals, yet none of those victories filled the hollow left by the unanswered question of what had happened to her child. The room believed it was in the presence of power, but Eleanor knew the truth. She was in the presence of absence, dining not with friends or allies, but with a ghost. She folded her napkin across her lap, lifted her glass, and let the silence settle again, for tonight was not indulgence, but remembrance. The light from the chandeliers above seemed to follow Eleanor as she lifted her hand, and the bracelet at her wrist caught every flicker of gold and silver that passed through the room. It was a simple thing by her standards, a slender band set with small diamonds, and a single deep sapphire that glowed like midnight when the light struck it. To strangers it was only a piece of jewelry, elegant but modest compared to the crowns of wealth she could wear if she wished. To Eleanor it was not decoration, it was memory. It was the last tie to her daughter Lillian, the child who had once laughed so loudly in these very rooms, then vanished into the shadows of unanswered questions. The bracelet had been made as a pair, commissioned from a Parisian jeweler, when Lillian turned 18. Eleanor had kept one and gifted the other to her daughter, telling her they would always be connected, no matter the storms of life. She could still recall the way Lillian had slipped it onto her wrist, smiling with the kind of careless joy only youth carries, promising she would treasure it forever. That promise echoed bitterly now, because forever had not lasted. Lillian had disappeared without a trace, without a letter or a phone call, leaving only rumors and whispers behind. The police had searched, investigators had pried into every corner, but years turned to decades and the trail went cold. All that remained was Eleanor's bracelet and the ache of absence each time she touched it. As Eleanor rested her hand against the linen tablecloth, her mind drifted to the nights when she would walk through her empty penthouse halls, her reflection flashing in tall windows, the bracelet heavy on her wrist. She would pause by the piano Lillian once played, or the balcony where she used to stand, gazing over the city lights, and she would imagine her daughter walking back through the door, still wearing the twin band of sapphires and diamonds. But the door had never opened, and Eleanor had grown old waiting. Her empire had flourished during those years. Towers rose in her name, hospitals bore her crest, universities honored her with degrees. She had conquered markets and beaten rivals, yet victory never erased the sorrow. She wore the bracelet to board meetings and gala dinners, to weddings and funerals, not to show wealth but to keep her daughter near. It was a charm and a wound, beauty pressed against pain. Those who saw it thought it was an heirloom from her husband, or perhaps a trinket from her youth. No one knew the truth, and Eleanor never explained. Some secrets were too sacred to share. As she sat in the grand restaurant that evening, she lifted her glass of wine and felt the cool weight of the bracelet against her skin. Her fingers brushed it lightly, as if by touching it she could summon the ghost of her daughter, the missing voice that still haunted her dreams. To everyone else it was only a jewel, but to Eleanor it was the symbol of her greatest loss and the unanswered mystery that ruled her heart. Claire Evans balanced the tray with both hands, her shoulders tight and her steps measured, the weight of the crystal glasses pressing down on her slender arms. She moved through the crowded dining room with the grace of someone who had done this too many times to count, weaving past suits and gowns, slipping by chairs pushed out at awkward angles, never spilling a drop. At 24, she had learned to keep her expression steady, polite but distant, the smile of someone who had to survive on tips but could not afford to let her real feelings show. Her uniform was pressed, yet the seams at the cuffs had begun to fray. The apron tied at her waist had faded from years of washing, and her shoes, once plain black leather, were cracked across the toes and worn thin at the soles. Every detail of her appearance spoke of work without rest, of nights when she walked home in the rain, and mornings when she rose again before the sun. Life had not given Claire the luxury of choice. She had grown up in foster care, her earliest memories a blur of unfamiliar houses and voices, promising to keep her safe, then fading away when the next move came. She had learned early to travel light, to hold on to nothing she could not carry, and to protect her little brother Alex as best she could. He had been her anchor, her reason to keep moving, the small boy who looked at her with wide eyes and trusted that she would make sense of a world that had never made sense to either of them. By the time she was 18, she had signed herself out of the system and taken Alex with her, determined he would not fall through the same cracks. Now, Alex was 17, still too thin, still coughing too often, and still depending on her for everything. Claire worked double shifts to pay rent on their small apartment, stretching her wages and her tips until there was nothing left to stretch. Every dollar she made at the restaurant went toward rent, bills, and the medicine Alex needed. It was never enough, but she never let him see her despair. To him, she was steady, the older sister who never wavered, who told him he would go to college one day, that his future would not look like hers. She clung to those words even when doubt gnawed at her in the quiet hours. The restaurant itself was a world far from her own, a palace of wealth and performance where people ordered $500 bottles of wine without looking at the price. Claire had learned to read the room, to know which guests demanded endless attention and which preferred silence, to carry trays like armor and wear her uniform like a shield. She was invisible to most, just another face serving plates, yet she noticed everything. She saw the way smiles stiffened when bills arrived, the way laughter sharpened when deals were whispered over dessert. She carried these observations with her like secrets, tucked away behind her polite nods and quiet voice. That night, as she moved between tables, Claire felt the familiar ache in her feet and the weight of exhaustion pressing down. But she kept her head high. She had no family name, no fortune, no legacy. But she had Alex, and she had her resolve. The world had taken much from her, yet she refused to let it take her hope. Claire moved carefully toward the table by the windows, balancing a tray of wine glasses with the steady focus of someone who knew that one mistake could cost more than just a tip. The older woman seated at the head of the table seemed distant at first glance, her silver hair arranged neatly, her posture so straight it seemed carved from stone. Claire had no idea she was serving one of the wealthiest women in the city, no idea that every head in the room had turned when Eleanor Whitmore walked in. To Claire she was simply another guest, one more plate to deliver, one more order to remember, another name she would never know. She leaned forward slightly, setting down the glasses one by one with practiced precision. The light from the chandeliers above fell in perfect angles across the table, bouncing against silver cutlery and crystal goblets. As Claire shifted her arm to place the final glass, her cuff slipped back just enough to reveal the bracelet at her wrist. The sapphire caught the glow like a drop of midnight fire, the diamonds sparkled with sudden brilliance, and the entire table seemed to pause with it. Eleanor's eyes, sharp even at 82, locked onto the flash of blue. For a heartbeat she forgot where she was, forgot the presence of her aides, forgot the steady hum of the restaurant around her. The bracelet gleamed exactly as she remembered it, the shape of the clasp, the placement of the stones, the unique curve of the setting. Her breath caught, her chest tightened, and her hand trembled against the edge of the table. She reached forward instinctively, then pulled back, the weight of memory crashing over her. It was impossible, yet she was seeing it. The twin to the bracelet on her own wrist, the one she had given her daughter on her 18th birthday, the one she had never expected to lay eyes on again. It was here, worn by a young woman in a faded uniform with tired eyes and scuffed shoes, a waitress who could not possibly understand what she carried on her wrist. Eleanor's mind raced, fragments of the past spinning through her thoughts, the sound of her daughter's laughter, the sight of her smile, the echo of her last words before she vanished. Claire felt the weight of the woman's gaze but did not understand it. She glanced up nervously, uncertain if she had made a mistake, unsure why this guest looked at her, as if she had turned into something extraordinary. Claire pulled her sleeve down quickly, embarrassed by the sudden attention, thinking perhaps the bracelet looked out of place on someone like her. It was the only thing she owned of value, found years ago in a box of odds and ends at a street market, bought for a few dollars because she thought it was beautiful. She had never once imagined it could mean more. The silence stretched between them, heavy and strange. Eleanor's fingers hovered above the tablecloth, trembling slightly, while Claire stepped back, heart beating faster, though she could not explain why. The bracelet, the impossible twin, had returned, and with it came the stir of a past that refused to stay buried. The question came sharp and sudden, slicing through the gentle hum of conversation, like a blade. Eleanor's voice, though aged, carried the weight of command, each word ringing across the dining room with a clarity that left no space for doubt. "Where did you get that bracelet?" she demanded, her tone shaking not from weakness, but from emotion held too long inside. Claire froze at once, her body stiff, the tray in her hand nearly tipping as her breath caught in her chest. She had never been spoken to like that by a guest, not with such force, not with the eyes of an entire room turning toward her in an instant. Her hand moved without thought, clutching her wrist as if she could hide the sapphire and diamonds from sight, as if pulling her sleeve down would erase the spark that had set this fire. The bracelet pressed cold against her skin, heavier than it had ever felt before, and her heart raced so quickly she thought she might faint. Around her the restaurant seemed to stop breathing. Waiters froze mid-step, one holding a tray of oysters in the air, another caught halfway through, pouring a glass of wine. Diners leaned forward in their chairs, whispers spreading like a ripple across still water. The hush was almost unbearable. Even the crackle of the fireplace sounded distant. Claire's throat tightened, and when she tried to speak, no words came out. She shook her head faintly, confusion and fear locking her in place. Her first thought was that she had done something terribly wrong, though she could not imagine what. It was only a bracelet, something she had worn for years, something she had never thought twice about. To her, it was nothing more than a lucky find, a small piece of beauty she had clung to in a life where beauty was rare. But to Eleanor, it was not simple. Her eyes glistened, her hand trembling, as it pressed against her chest. The sight of that bracelet on this young woman was like seeing a ghost step out of the shadows, a fragment of the past alive again in the present. The weight of memory pressed on her shoulders, but her voice remained strong. "Answer me," she urged, her gaze fixed unshakably on Claire. Claire's lips parted, finally forcing out a shaky whisper. I bought it years ago," she stammered, though her own words sounded weak, even to her. She looked around helplessly, every eye in the room pinning her down. The air was thick with curiosity, the tension so tight it felt as if a single breath might shatter it. No one moved, no one dared. The music from the string quartet faltered and stopped, the violinist lowering his bow with wide eyes. The entire restaurant was caught in the moment, every polished surface and crystal glass reflecting the silent drama unfolding at one table. Claire stood frozen, her hand still gripping her wrist, while Eleanor's demand echoed in the quiet, a question heavy enough to bring an empire of strangers to a standstill. Eleanor's vision blurred as she stared at the bracelet on the young waitress's wrist, and the dining room around her seemed to dissolve. In its place came a flood of memory, sharp and unyielding, dragging her back through time to moments she had tried so hard to bury. She saw Lillian at 6 years old, her laughter ringing through the grand halls of the Whitmore estate, the sound brighter than the polished keys of the piano she pounded with clumsy fingers. Eleanor had stood behind her then, smiling despite herself, her hand resting on her daughter's small shoulder as she told her to slow down, to learn the notes with patience. But Lillian had only laughed harder, her curls bouncing, her eyes sparkling, insisting the music was meant to be played with joy and not rules. The scene shifted, the memory twisting forward, and Eleanor saw her daughter again, older now, 16, and restless, fire in her voice, anger in her eyes. They were in the same room where they had once laughed together, but the piano stood silent, and the air between them was sharp with words neither could take back. Lillian had accused her of control, of smothering her with expectations, of chaining her to a future she did not want. Eleanor, proud and stubborn, had answered with her own thunder, telling her daughter she was reckless, ungrateful, blind to the sacrifices laid at her feet. The argument had ended with a door slamming so hard the walls shook, and that echo still haunted Eleanor's nights. Another flash, gentler now, the memory of Lillian's 18th birthday. The house had been filled with flowers, the halls echoing with music from a hired quartet, the guests dressed in their finest. Eleanor had placed the small velvet box in her daughter's hand, her voice unsteady as she said, "This will always bind us." Inside was the bracelet, diamonds and sapphire set in delicate white gold, made to match the one Eleanor wore herself. She had chosen it as a symbol, a reminder that no matter what battles raged between them, they were still mother and daughter, connected by something unbreakable. Lillian's face had softened when she saw it, her lips curving into a smile, her eyes shining for just a moment, with love. She had promised she would wear it forever. And then, like mist fading at dawn, The memories collapsed into the hollow truth. Lillian had vanished not long after, leaving her room cold, her belongings scattered, the bracelet the only clue that carried her name. Eleanor had searched with every resource her fortune could buy. Investigators scouring cities, rumors chased across continents, but no answer ever came. The silence stretched for decades, and the bracelet on Eleanor's own wrist became a relic of grief, a daily reminder of the daughter she had lost. Now, staring at its twin, the flood of memory struck her with such force she could scarcely breathe. It was as if the ghost of Lillian herself stood before her, laughing, arguing, smiling, all at once. And Eleanor's heart trembled under the weight of it. Claire's cheeks burned as every eye in the room seemed to pin her in place. The older woman's demand still rang in her ears, her voice filled with such force that Claire felt as if she had done something terrible without knowing what it was. She swallowed hard and forced her lips to move, her voice small and uneven. "I bought it at a flea market years ago," she said quickly, the words tumbling out too fast, her throat tight. She tried to sound calm, tried to sound casual, but the tremor in her voice betrayed her. She had never been questioned about the bracelet before. Most people hardly noticed it, and those who did only gave a polite comment, saying it was pretty, asking where she found it. She always gave the same answer, that she had picked it up at a market stall on a Saturday when she was 17, paying a handful of bills for it, because something about the sapphire had drawn her in. It had been her one indulgence, her one treasure, in a life that had been stripped of anything beautiful. Now, for the first time, the simple story did not seem enough. The woman across the table did not look satisfied, not in the least. Her eyes, sharp and wet with some emotion Claire could not name, did not waver. She stared at the bracelet as if it were alive, as if it held secrets only she could read. Claire shifted on her feet, wishing she could disappear, wishing she had left the bracelet at home that morning. Her sleeve had slipped, her cuff had betrayed her, and now she stood trapped under the gaze of someone who looked at her as though she were the answer to a riddle written long before she was born. Whispers rippled around the room. Claire could feel them like a current against her skin. She caught fragments, words like thief and scandal and family heirloom, and her chest tightened. She wanted to shout that it was not stolen, that she had every right to wear it, that it was just a piece of jewelry she had found and loved. But the words stuck in her throat, her denial caught between fear and pride. She clutched her wrist tighter, her fingers pressing the metal into her skin until it hurt. Her mind scrambled for explanations. Maybe the woman thought it belonged to her. Maybe she had lost something similar. Maybe it was just a strange coincidence. Claire wanted to believe that, but the way the woman's face shifted, the way her hand trembled as she reached slightly toward her, told her this was no coincidence. The bracelet was more than it seemed, at least to her. Claire's heart hammered with confusion. She had no idea why this piece of jewelry, why this moment. She only knew that she was being stared at as if her very existence mattered in a way she could not understand. The silence stretched too long. Claire's voice cracked as she whispered again, "It was just a flea market." But even as she said it, she knew no one in the room believed her. Gregory Hale arrived with the swiftness of a man who had practiced this performance many times before. His polished shoes clicked against the marble as he cut through the silence, his smile wide, his voice warm, though his eyes were sharp with calculation. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said smoothly, bowing his head just enough to show respect without humility, "please forgive the disturbance. I assure you everything is under control." His words were meant for the billionaire at the table, but his hand reached for Claire, his fingers curling around her arm with a grip that felt more like a warning than guidance. Claire flinched, the pressure of his touch making her pulse quicken. She kept her face still, forcing herself not to wince, but inside she was trembling. Gregory's thumb pressed against her wrist, right where the bracelet sat under her sleeve, and his whisper slid into her ear like a knife. "Say nothing," he muttered, the warmth of his false smile never fading for the watching guests. To anyone else it looked like a protective gesture, a manager steadying a clumsy server, but Claire knew better. His grip was iron, his tone cold, and the meaning behind his words was clear. Eleanor's sharp eyes narrowed. She saw the way Claire stiffened, saw the tension in the girl's shoulders, saw the false ease in the manager's expression. She had spent a lifetime dealing with men like him, men who wrapped their ambition in charm, who smiled while they twisted the truth. Her fingers tapped against the tablecloth, a small sound that carried more weight than thunder. Gregory did not look at her directly, but he felt the pressure of her silence bearing down. "Mrs. Whitmore, please, allow us to handle this," he said louder now, turning slightly to address the room. "Our staff is dedicated to your comfort. I will personally ensure this young lady apologizes for the confusion." His grip on Claire's arm tightened as he pulled her half a step back, as though he could remove her from sight and erase the spark that had started the fire. Claire's throat tightened. She wanted to speak, to explain, but Gregory's hold reminded her of every debt he claimed she owed, every fabricated mistake he had used to trap her. He had cornered her before, always with that same smile, always reminding her how easily he could ruin her, how quickly she could lose everything she had fought to keep. She lowered her eyes, her denial of moments earlier now caught behind her lips. The diners, still hushed, exchanged glances. They saw the billionaire matriarch watching intently, they saw the waitress caught like a bird in a cage, and they saw the manager's polished mask. Whispers rose again, suspicion threading through curiosity. Gregory adjusted his tie, his smile never faltering, but his jaw clenched hard. He leaned closer to Claire, his whisper sharp enough to sting. "One wrong word and you're finished," he warned. To the room it looked like control had returned, but beneath the glittering lights the truth simmered. Claire stood frozen. Eleanor studied every detail, and Gregory Hale's charm cracked under the weight of his own menace. Arthur Pendleton had been in enough courtrooms and boardrooms to know when silence carried more meaning than noise. Sitting only a few tables away, he watched the scene unfold with the quiet patience of a man who built his reputation on observation. His glass of wine sat untouched, his meal cooling before him, as his sharp eyes studied the young waitress standing frozen beside Eleanor's table. He noted the way her shoulders tensed under the grip of the manager, the way her hand instinctively shielded her wrist, and most of all the way Eleanor leaned forward, her face pale with recognition. Something important was unraveling, and Arthur had learned long ago that important things rarely announced themselves with fanfare. He let his gaze linger on the waitress, taking in the details others might overlook. She was young, mid-20s perhaps, her dark hair tied back in a practical knot, her uniform neat but worn. She had the tired posture of someone carrying more than one life's worth of burdens, yet there was dignity in the way she held herself. Arthur tilted his head slightly, studying her face. Her cheekbones, the curve of her chin, the shape of her eyes, they all carried a familiarity that tugged at memory. He had spent decades working beside Eleanor, had seen the photographs she kept locked in drawers, pictures of her daughter Lillian in happier days, smiling with the confidence of youth. The resemblance was not exact, but it was close enough to stir unease. When the girl spoke earlier, insisting in a trembling voice that she had bought the bracelet at a flea market, Arthur had caught the slight lilt in her words, the faint cadence that matched recordings he had once heard of Lillian. It was not proof, but it was something, and for a man like Arthur, small details often grew into truths. He adjusted his glasses and leaned back in his chair, appearing casual, yet every sense was alert. He glanced at Eleanor. Her hand trembled against the tablecloth, her eyes locked on the girl, as if she were staring at a ghost. Arthur knew that look. It was the same one he had seen in board meetings when Eleanor uncovered betrayal, the same one she wore when she pieced together a truth no one else dared to see. Only now it was not a rival scheme she was unraveling, but the possibility of something far more personal, something she had not allowed herself to hope for in decades. Arthur's mind moved quickly, sorting through possibilities. Coincidence was one, but unlikely. A stolen heirloom was another, though the girl's reaction did not carry the arrogance of a thief, but the fear of someone suddenly pulled into a storm she did not understand. The third possibility, the one that made his pulse quicken despite his calm exterior, was that Eleanor's long-vanished daughter had left behind more than a mystery. The girl's face, her voice, her very presence suggested a connection too strong to dismiss. He did not rise, not yet. Arthur knew timing was everything. For now he would watch and wait, because revelations of this weight did not need to be forced. They revealed themselves when the world was ready, and Arthur Pendleton sensed that moment was very close. The restaurant manager tried to smooth things over with his polished smile, but Eleanor Whitmore was not a woman who could be silenced with charm. Her voice cut through his rehearsed reassurances, steady and commanding. She asked for a private room, somewhere quiet, somewhere away from the curious stares and whispers. No one dared argue. The staff scrambled to open the small office at the back of the restaurant, and within moments Eleanor was standing there, her presence filling the cramped space as completely as it had filled the grand dining room. Claire followed reluctantly, her feet dragging, her stomach twisted in knots. She felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her shoulders, heavier than the trays she carried every night. The office smelled faintly of paper and cleaning solution, with shelves stacked untidily with ledgers and wine lists. A single lamp glowed on the desk, its light catching the silver in Eleanor's hair and the sapphire on her wrist. The sight of the twin bracelet gleaming against her own aged skin made Claire's breath falter. She had never seen anything so identical to the piece she wore, and suddenly the air seemed too thick to breathe. Eleanor turned, her eyes sharper than any courtroom judge, her voice calm but burning with demand. "That bracelet belonged to my daughter. Where did you really get it?" The words carried no room for lies, yet Claire's throat tightened around the truth. She hesitated, glancing at the closed door, wishing she could escape the intensity of those eyes. Her fingers twisted nervously at her apron, her lips parting. But the words did not come easily. The memory of the market flashed in her mind, the dusty stall filled with forgotten trinkets, the old man who had sold it to her for less than the price of a dinner. She wanted to say that again, to repeat the story she had always told. But under Eleanor's gaze the explanation felt flimsy, almost insulting. Her voice shook when she finally managed to whisper, "I told you I found it years ago." Eleanor's face did not soften. She stepped closer, leaning on her cane but still holding herself tall. Her eyes scanned Claire's features with unsettling precision, studying every line, every shadow, as though searching for echoes of the past. "My daughter was wearing that bracelet the night she vanished," she said quietly, her voice thick with memory. "It has not been seen since. Do not tell me you simply found it." Claire's chest tightened. She felt like a child again, caught between truth and survival, between the desperate need to protect herself and the impossible weight of this woman's grief. Fear whispered in her ear, reminding her of the manager's threats, of the debts he claimed she owed, of how easily he could destroy her fragile job. Yet something in Eleanor's tone stirred something else in her, something she could not name. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Claire's eyes filled with confusion and a flicker of guilt, as though her very existence carried answers she did not understand. She clutched her wrist harder, her pulse racing beneath the sapphire, torn between the safety of denial and the risk of truth. Arthur Pendleton stepped quietly into the small office, carrying with him the same calm steadiness that had seen Eleanor through countless storms. He closed the door behind him, shutting out the low hum of the restaurant, and in his hand was a thin leather folder. His movements were deliberate, his expression unreadable, but his eyes carried a weight that made Claire's pulse quicken. Eleanor turned toward him, a silent exchange passing between them, and Arthur gave a small nod before opening the folder. He drew out a photograph, old but well kept, the edges softened by years of handling. Without a word he laid it on the desk under the glow of the lamp. Claire's eyes flickered downward, and the breath caught in her throat. The young woman in the picture smiled in frozen time, her face lit with youthful confidence, her curls brushing her shoulders. She wore the same sapphire bracelet that now burned against Claire's skin. The resemblance was undeniable, the shape of the jaw, the tilt of the eyes, even the curve of the lips when smiling. It was like looking into a mirror distorted only by years and distance. Claire's heart pounded as she lifted the photograph with trembling fingers. Her voice wavered as she whispered, "Who is this?" Though deep inside she already knew the answer. Eleanor's voice, soft but steady, filled the space. "My daughter, Lillian. She disappeared when she was not much older than you are now." The name echoed in Claire's ears, strangely familiar, as if she had heard it once long ago in a dream she could not fully remember. Her vision blurred with sudden heat in her eyes, and she blinked quickly, but the tears would not stay away. Memories stirred within her, faint and incomplete. She recalled nights as a little girl when she and Alex had whispered about the mother they never knew, about lullabies half remembered, about the faint scent of perfume that lingered on an old scarf tucked away in one of the boxes that had followed them from one foster home to another. She had told herself those fragments meant nothing, that they were the blurry imaginings of children trying to fill empty spaces. Now, staring at the photograph, she felt the ground beneath her shift. Arthur studied her reaction carefully, his gaze moving between Claire and the photograph, his mind already piecing together a puzzle that had remained unsolved for decades. Eleanor stood in silence, her hand pressed lightly against her chest, her eyes shining with a mixture of hope and fear. She saw more than resemblance in the girl's face. She saw the possibility of blood, the possibility of a truth long denied to her. Claire lowered the photograph slowly, her hands shaking. She wanted to deny it, to insist again that she had bought the bracelet at a market, that she was no one of importance, but the image in her hand refused to let her go. The woman in the photograph could have been her, a generation apart, a life rewritten. The weight of it pressed against her chest until she could hardly breathe. For the first time in her life, she wondered if everything she thought she knew about her past had been a lie. The door had barely closed before it opened again, and Gregory Hale stepped inside, his polished smile stretched too wide, his eyes sharp with fury hidden beneath charm. He carried himself like a man used to controlling a room, his tailored suit tight across his shoulders, his cologne heavy in the small office. He glanced at Eleanor and Arthur with a respectful nod, then turned his full attention on Claire. His hand found her shoulder with the same false gentleness he used in front of guests, his grip firm enough to make her stiffen. "Excuse us," he said smoothly, his voice low but edged with warning. "There seems to be some confusion here. Claire is mistaken, and I would hate for this fine evening to be ruined by her nervous chatter." His smile never faltered as he leaned closer to her ear, whispering words meant only for her. "Remember what we talked about, Claire. Remember what you owe." Her stomach turned cold. She knew what he meant, the phantom debt he had chained to her name. Months ago he had cornered her in the back hallway, accusing her of pocketing tips that were never missing, waving a ledger filled with numbers she had never seen before. He told her she owed thousands, that she had stolen from the restaurant, that she would be blacklisted from every decent job if she did not repay it. At first she had protested, begged him to check again, but he only smiled, showing her the neat columns of figures that proved his lie. From that day forward, she had been under his grip. He told her he would garnish her paychecks, that he would take her tips until the debt was cleared. He reminded her that her younger brother depended on her job, that she could not risk losing it. He made her feel small, powerless, trapped in a cage she could not break. Every time she thought of fighting back, she saw Alex's face, thin and pale, and she stayed silent. Now, with Eleanor's piercing eyes locked on her, Gregory's voice pressed harder. "Say it was a market trinket. Say you made a mistake. If you open your mouth about anything else, you're done here. No more job, no more paycheck, no more medicine for your brother. Do you want him to suffer because of your foolishness?" Claire's hands shook at her sides. She glanced at Eleanor, who waited with expectation, and then at Arthur, who studied her with quiet intensity. The truth pressed against her lips, but Gregory's whisper poisoned her courage. His fingers tightened on her arm, and to anyone else it looked like a protective gesture, but she felt the bruise of his control. Her heart pounded as she whispered, I can't." The words slipped out, heavy with fear. Gregory's smile widened, satisfied, as if he had won again. Eleanor's eyes narrowed, sensing the unspoken war taking place before her. Claire stood in silence, torn between survival and truth, knowing that either choice would cost her everything. Arthur Pendleton left the restaurant with his usual calm expression, his stride unhurried, his shoulders relaxed, but his mind already spinning. He had learned long ago that storms often began in whispers, and what he had witnessed in that office was the start of something much larger. He slipped into the back seat of his town car, gave the driver a quiet nod, and pulled his phone from his coat pocket. His contacts were men and women who owed him favors, investigators who worked in shadows, accountants who could read hidden trails like maps, and lawyers who understood the language of deceit. With a few measured calls, he set wheels in motion, his tone calm, his instructions precise, every word carrying weight. By the time the car reached his office, Arthur already had his first reports. Gregory Hale's name had appeared in small lawsuits years ago, staff complaints that were quickly buried, settlements paid to silence voices that had tried to rise against him. He had hopped from one high-end restaurant to another, each time leaving behind whispers of misconduct, each time walking away with his record polished by forged recommendations. Arthur's jaw tightened as he scrolled through the notes, his glasses reflecting the glow of the screen. He was not surprised. Men like Hale thrived by pressing on those least able to fight back, feeding off desperation like parasites. Another call, another favor, and more information poured in. There were bank transfers that did not match his salary, hidden accounts in shell names, and a suspicious company that billed the restaurant for services that never existed. The pattern was clear, exploitation woven into numbers. But what unsettled Arthur most were the records of staff. Waitresses, busboys, dishwashers, all listed with deductions for debts, fabricated charges of theft or mistakes, money siphoned from their paychecks under the guise of punishment. He was a predator cloaked in authority, bleeding the vulnerable because they had no one to defend them. Arthur leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled, his thoughts steady despite the anger simmering beneath. Claire's frightened eyes haunted him, her trembling voice insisting she bought the bracelet at a flea market while Hale's grip pressed her into silence. Arthur now understood why. She was not the first he had trapped, but she might be the last. Her bracelet was not just a mystery of family, it was the thread that could unravel the entire scheme. If Hale had been willing to silence her so fiercely, it meant she stood closer to the truth than anyone before her. He dialed one last number, his voice low. "I need everything," he told the investigator on the other end. "Every ledger, every false invoice, every staff complaint. Discretion is vital." His eyes fell on the photograph of Lillian he had carried earlier, and then drifted to the memory of Claire's face when she saw it. This was no longer about coincidence. It was about justice, for Eleanor, for Claire, for every life Hale had crushed under his false authority. Arthur closed the file, but his resolve was sharp. The secrets Hale thought he had buried were about to surface, and when they did, the truth would shatter far more than one man's career. The apartment was small and worn, the paint on the walls peeling in corners, the hum of the radiator filling the silence as Claire closed the door behind her. She leaned against it for a moment, her chest heavy, her wrist burning, as if the bracelet had turned into a brand. Alex sat on the couch with his textbooks spread around him, his thin frame bent over notes he could barely afford, but studied as if they were lifelines. He looked up when she entered, his eyes bright with curiosity and concern. He knew his sister too well, knew when something was wrong. Claire dropped into the chair across from him, her hands covering her face. For a long moment she said nothing, only drew deep breaths that shook in her chest. Finally she lowered her hands and whispered, "Something happened at work." Her voice was hoarse, her eyes tired. Alex set his books aside and leaned forward, listening with the quiet patience he had always carried. She told him everything, from the way the old woman's eyes had fixed on her bracelet, to the question that froze the entire restaurant, to the photograph of Lillian placed under the lamp. Her voice cracked as she spoke, her fear spilling out, her confusion rising with every word. When she finished, silence stretched between them, broken only by the hum of the heater and the distant sound of traffic outside. Alex stared at her wrist, at the gleam of the sapphire and diamonds. He was quiet for a long time. Then he spoke softly, almost as if recalling a dream. "I remember that bracelet," he said, and Claire's eyes widened. He nodded, his brow furrowing as he reached back into childhood memories. "I was so little, maybe 3 or 4. But I remember a woman singing to us, a lullaby, soft and low. She smelled like flowers, and I remember her hand brushing my hair. She wore that bracelet, or one that looked just like it. She said, 'I'll come back for you.'" Claire's breath caught. She had always thought Alex's early memories were too faint to trust, but the certainty in his voice shook her. She tried to smile, but it wavered. "You really think it was her?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Alex leaned forward, his thin hands gripping hers. "I don't think—" "I know. We weren't left because we were unwanted. We were left because something happened. That bracelet is proof. It's not just some market trinket, Claire. It means we belonged to someone once. It means she tried to leave us with a promise." Tears welled in Claire's eyes, sliding down her cheeks before she could stop them. For so long she had carried the weight of believing they were forgotten, that their lives began with absence and ended with struggle. Now Alex's words cracked that belief, letting in the faint light of possibility. She squeezed his hands tightly, her voice trembling. "If you're right, then everything we thought we knew about where we came from has been a lie." Alex's gaze was steady, filled with quiet determination. "Then it's time we found the truth." The night after the confrontation, Eleanor Whitmore sat alone in her study, the city lights flickering through tall glass windows like distant stars. Her cane rested beside her chair, her untouched tea cooling on the table, but her mind was not on the comforts around her. For hours she had replayed the image of the waitress in her mind, the glint of the sapphire bracelet, the tremor in her voice, the fear in her eyes. Every instinct she possessed, sharpened through decades of building and defending an empire, told her this was not coincidence. It was fate, reaching out in the most unexpected way. She had spent a lifetime protecting her name, keeping her family's legacy polished and unblemished in the public eye. She knew what whispers could do, how one scandal could stain a reputation that took years to build. Yet, as she stared at the firelight dancing across the walls, she realized that none of it mattered anymore. What use was fortune or reputation if the truth about her daughter's disappearance remained buried? What good was her empire if she could not reach out to the girl who might be all that remained of the child she had lost? Her hand drifted to her own bracelet, fingers tracing the familiar curve of the stones. She whispered Lillian's name, her voice breaking in the stillness of the room. She thought of Claire's face, so startlingly familiar, and the way her voice cracked with fear when she spoke. That girl had grown up with hardship, etched into her every gesture. Yet there was dignity, too, a strength that reminded Eleanor of Lillian's fire. If there was even the smallest chance, she could not let her slip away. The next day she summoned Arthur to her side. He listened carefully, his sharp mind already piecing together the dangers. He warned her of the risks, of the headlines that would explode if whispers spread, of Gregory Hale's influence, and the trail of dirt he would surely fling in defense. Eleanor heard it all, then raised her hand to silence him. Her voice was soft, but it carried the certainty of command. "I will risk scandal, I will risk fortune, I will risk every carefully built wall around me if it means uncovering the truth. This is not business, Arthur. This is blood." Later that afternoon, Eleanor called Claire to a quiet corner of the restaurant, away from the curious eyes and the smirking manager. The girl stood stiffly, nervous, unsure why she had been summoned again. Eleanor stepped close, her cane tapping lightly against the floor, and reached for Claire's trembling hands. She held them gently, but with the weight of intention. Her eyes locked on the girl's, and her voice dropped to a whisper. "If you are who I think you are my blood. No man will harm you, no debt will chain you, not while I draw breath. I will give you protection, and I will give you the means to find the truth of who you are." For the first time in decades, Eleanor felt the hollow ache in her chest shift, not with grief, but with hope. The plan was set in motion with the kind of precision only Arthur Pendleton could design. He spent the afternoon on discreet phone calls, his tone calm, his words measured, until every piece was aligned. The restaurant would continue its evening service as if nothing was unusual, but beneath the polished marble floors and glittering chandeliers, a storm was waiting. Eleanor arrived quietly, her expression serene to anyone watching, though her eyes burned with purpose. Claire moved through her shift as though it were any other night, carrying trays, refilling glasses, masking her nerves with the polite smile she had perfected. Only she and Arthur knew what was hidden in her apron pocket, a small device no bigger than a button, recording every word that passed between her and the manager who had chained her life with lies. Gregory Hale was in fine spirits that night, his false charm on display, as he laughed with wealthy patrons and barked hushed orders at the staff. He smirked when he caught Claire's eye, reminding her silently of the debt he claimed she owed, the trap he had woven with his fabricated ledger. He summoned her to the back office midway through the evening, his voice low, but his expression sharp with menace. She obeyed, her heart hammering, but her hands steady as she closed the door behind her. Inside the office, the mask dropped. Hale leaned close, his tone venomous. He reminded her once again of the stolen tips, of the thousands she supposedly owed, of how quickly he could end her job and her brother's fragile future. "You think anyone will believe you over me?" he hissed, his eyes glittering with arrogance. "You will keep your mouth shut, Claire, or I'll bury you under so much debt you won't crawl out in a lifetime." He paced the room, waving the ledger like a weapon. "These numbers tell the story I want them to tell. As far as anyone else is concerned, you are guilty, and I am generous for letting you work it off." Claire swallowed hard, her fear real, but this time she let him talk. She let him pile threats on her shoulders, let him sneer about how powerless she was. Every word was caught by the small device hidden in her apron, every syllable a nail in the coffin of his lies. When he finally leaned across the desk, his voice dropping to a cruel whisper, admitting that the books were fake, that he had siphoned money for years, that he had trapped staff in debts that never existed. She felt the weight of the moment settle in her chest. It was enough. Arthur's watch buzzed in the dining room, a signal from the unit waiting outside. As Claire walked back onto the floor, her hands shaking but her head high, the doors of the restaurant opened and agents swept in, their jackets marked with the emblems of the FBI and financial crimes. Patrons gasped, forks froze halfway to mouths, and Gregory Hale's smile faltered as he was led away in cuffs, his ledger clutched no longer in his hand but in the evidence bag of justice. The restaurant was left in stunned silence after Gregory Hale was taken away in handcuffs, his polished mask stripped, his charm revealed for the fraud it had always been. Patrons whispered in disbelief, staff stood frozen, and Claire stood among them all, her hands trembling, but her heart strangely lighter than it had been in years. She had faced her worst fear and survived. For the first time since Hale had trapped her in his lies, she felt the weight of his threats lift from her shoulders like chains falling to the ground. She wanted to cry, but the presence of Eleanor Whitmore standing so still at the center of the chaos held her steady. Eleanor's eyes never left Claire. The sapphire bracelet gleamed on the young woman's wrist, catching the light like a signal of fate. Arthur returned to her side, a leather folder tucked under his arm, and his calm voice cut through the murmur of the room. "It's time," he said quietly. Together they guided Claire away from the stairs, into the office where the sting had begun, closing the door behind them. Claire braced herself, not knowing what more could possibly be asked of her, but the look on Eleanor's face was not sharp with judgment. It was softened by something she had not shown in decades. Arthur opened the folder, his precise hands pulling out brittle papers that smelled faintly of dust and age. Birth records, adoption files, documents buried for years in legal shadows, hidden by red tape and silence. He spread them carefully across the desk, his voice calm and certain as he explained. Decades ago, after Lillian vanished, a child matching her description had been placed into the foster system under another name. The trail had been faint, nearly erased by clerical errors, but the pieces lined up now with startling clarity. Names, dates, and places formed a map of truth. The files told the story that no investigator had been able to uncover, the story of a child taken from her mother's world and dropped into a system that never gave her answers. Claire's hands shook as she traced the faded ink on the documents, her breath catching in her throat. Her name was written there, her brother's too, woven into a history she had never known. She lifted her gaze to Eleanor, confusion and disbelief flooding her expression. "You're saying I'm her daughter?" The words cracked as they left her lips, too heavy to believe, yet too clear to deny. Eleanor reached across the desk, her wrinkled hand covering Claire's trembling one. Her eyes glistened as she whispered, "You are Lillian's child. You are my blood." The words broke through Claire's defenses, and tears spilled freely down her cheeks. For years she had believed she and Alex were abandoned, unwanted, left behind to survive alone. But now the truth stood before her, not abandonment, but loss, not rejection, but a cruel twist of fate that had kept them apart. The bracelet had been the proof, a glimmer of destiny, guiding her into Eleanor's path. What she thought was a trinket had been the key to her identity, a relic that carried the weight of love across decades. In that moment, as Eleanor pulled her into an embrace and held her close, Claire felt something she had never truly felt before. She belonged. The morning sun spilled across the city, painting the towers of glass and steel and gold, but inside the Whitmore estate, the air was calm and still. Eleanor stood in the great hall, her cane resting lightly at her side, her gaze fixed on the two figures before her. Claire looked small against the sweeping staircase and tall windows, her clothes plain, her hands clasped nervously in front of her. Beside her stood Alex, thin but steady, his wide eyes darting around the room in awe. For years they had known only cramped apartments and second-hand furniture, yet now they stood in a house that seemed to breathe history and power. Eleanor stepped forward slowly, her presence quiet but commanding. She reached for Claire's hand, her touch gentle, though her grip was firm, as if she feared the girl might vanish like a dream if she let go. The sapphire bracelet on Claire's wrist caught the light, glinting in harmony with its twin on Eleanor's arm. For a long moment the matriarch said nothing, simply studying the young woman's face, the reflection of Lillian so clear in her features that it made her chest ache. Then, with a steady breath, she unclasped her own bracelet. The sound of the latch opening was small, but it carried through the silence like a final seal breaking. She slipped it onto Claire's trembling wrist, her voice low but certain. "Now the pair is whole again." Claire's eyes blurred with tears as she looked down at both bracelets resting side by side. The weight of them was more than metal and stone. It was memory and belonging. It was the answer to a question she had carried all her life. She felt Alex's hand squeeze her shoulder, grounding her, reminding her that this moment was real. For the first time she believed they were no longer alone, no longer drifting through life as unwanted children. They were Whitmores, bound not by fortune, but by blood. Arthur stood quietly to the side, his sharp eyes softened by the rare sight of Eleanor's smile. He had seen her battle boardrooms, crush rivals, and endure the loneliness of her tower, but he had never seen her look so alive. The empire she had built, the wealth she had guarded, suddenly seemed less important than the two young lives standing before her. Eleanor straightened, her voice carrying across the hall. "Your debts are gone. Your struggles are over. From this day, your futures are secured." Her words rang with authority, not as a promise, but as a fact already written. Claire's knees weakened under the weight of it, but she did not let go of Eleanor's hand. Alex's eyes lit with something she had not seen in him for years, a spark of hope untouched by fear. The great hall seemed warmer then, filled not with echoes of loss, but with the hum of renewal. Eleanor Whitmore, once the loneliest woman in a city she ruled, finally had family to fight for again. And in that moment, surrounded by light and memory, a new legacy was born. If this story moved you like it moved us, don't forget to give it a like. And if you want more stories like this one, hit subscribe. We'd love to have you with us.